Welcome to a quite fascinating afternoon, I absolutely guarantee it. We're all looking forward to hearing from Eric Schmidt, who is the executive chairman of Google Inc. Probably some of you have never heard of it, but it's a small West Coast company. I think it's a startup somewhere. Eric has been the executive chairman of Google Inc. since 2011. But he's had a remarkable history of enormous activities in various sorts. Long ago, he was part of Bell Labs and Zlog Inc. and the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. He's paid his dues. He's changed the world. And it is truly astonishing, the kinds of things and the kinds of activities. Not very many people have been a part of a company that became a verb. And it is, we observed it in the past week, the kinds of, where does everybody go for information and the like. He's a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the Prime Minister's Advisory Council in UK. He's been inducted in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's got a PhD in computer science from UC Berkeley, a BS in electrical engineering from Princeton University. And most important, he's got a spectacular daughter, Sophie, who's a member of our first-year MVP class. So I'm not going to say much more than that, except to note that this is a book that he'll be talking about, or certainly referencing or whatever, The New Digital Age. It just came out in the last couple of days. Now, of course, most of you probably already read it. But if you haven't, I urge you to do so, whether it's in physical copy or one of the other various forms. It is a very big book. And I mean big in the most important sense of the word. It's going to be big in that sense that it's provocative and it will get a lot of attention. But it's big because it will really make you think and think very differently about a lot of things. Eric Schmidt is joined today by two people who also need relatively little introduction. One is David Gergen, someone who you've also probably never seen, but occasionally makes appearances on television, and he's also our co-director of the Center for Public Leadership. Next to him on the other side is Arkan Feng, who's a professor of democracy and citizenship. And his research is very heavily focused on the impacts of civic participation in public deliberation, but he's quite engaged in a set of issues that have to do with, first of all, digital HKS, our own initiatives of trying to get understand and make a difference. Mm-hmm. A transparency project, how do you use technology and other strategies to get much more transparency in government and so forth. Before I turn this over to our group here, I'd just like to thank the Center for Public Leadership, the Ask Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and the Joan Shorenstein Center for the Press, Politics, and Public Policy for organizing and co-sponsoring this event. I'd like to again welcome Eric and all of you. A big hand for our guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Great, thank you.
Good afternoon. This is an event we had not expected to happen just a few days ago, but here we are, and we're terribly delighted that Eric Schmidt has joined us. I might open with a quote from something that he published about 2.5 years ago in Foreign Affairs. That's a publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. And it was, the title of the piece was The Digital Disruption, and it was by Eric and by his co-author in the book, Jared Cohen. This was on November 2010. Opening paragraph, it predicted that, quote, governments will be caught off guard when large numbers of their citizens, armed with virtually nothing but cell phones, take part in many rebellions that challenge their authority. A month later, the Arab Spring began. With that as a background for the book that he's just written, I joined the dean and urging you to read it. It's a terrific read. I'd like to ask you what inspired you to write it, and what surprises did you find along the way yourself?
Well, first, I want to thank the dean and you guys for doing this, and acknowledge, of course, my daughter traveled with us and helped write the book, and she's well credited in the book as well. So she is actually the author of much of this, many of these particular points. Jared and I started this 2 years ago because there seemed to be a gap between what the foreign policy establishment and government was talking about and what the technology world was doing. And whether that gap was a lack of understanding or frankly an age bias, or one of these classic sort of generational gap issues, it wasn't clear. But in the subsequent 2 years, what we saw over and over again was that the old guys didn't get it. Classic example is Tunisia. The three of us went to Tunisia. We heard the story of Abu Aziz, who's the fellow who set himself on fire, which started the revolution. So the question is, what was the dictator, his name was Ben Ali, doing at the time? And the answer was he had censored everything, but he forgot to censor the internet. He was 80 years old. Okay? So one advice to him would be, you schmuck, you failed to censor the right thing. When we went to Myanmar and Burma, which of course just opened up a year and a half ago, and there are debates as to why it opened up. Was it brilliant democracy feelings from the generals, or was it conniving and careful self-interest in the face of great opposition? We can debate that. But we learned, for example, that the government had written in the law that you couldn't use email. So they wrote the law in 2004. This, of course, is a junta military government, and they banned Yahoo Mail and Hotmail. Everyone uses Gmail. So we'll take it, It's okay. Hopefully they'll let Hotmail and Yahoo Mail back into the country.
Okay. So why did you go with Sophie to North Korea? I mean, after all, you haven't played basketball.
No, in fact, I am permanently linked with Dennis Rodman.
Yeah.
In a way that would not have been a prediction.
Yes.
Months earlier. The conversation came around was, let's go visit the countries that are worst off. So we did a sort of tour of countries that are not countries you would normally go to, but which had very poor connectivity, and by far, North Korea is by far the most worst off. What we found was a country that was bizarrely, I don't know how to describe it, it's a cult in a very bizarre sense. And on the one hand, the impression when you're there is that life goes on, the kids are running around and smiling, people are playing in the playgrounds and that sort of stuff. Of course, there's no air pollution because there's no manufacturing, so the air is clear, unlike China where we had come from. But the thing that is most disturbing is the sense that there's no doubt, that there's no critical thinking, that people from birth are taught that this is the way and this is the only way. And they have because they have no independent source of information, they have no way of understanding that maybe this is not the only choice of organization of humans. And so we also found out that they have 1 million phones already in place with all the necessary infrastructure to turn on the internet. They just haven't turned it on. Technically, this is turning on the GPRS signal. Just takes a little button. So we tried various attempts to get them to turn it on. After we left, they actually opened up 3G roaming. And then 2 weeks ago, they turned it back off again. So I don't know what that tells you.
And there are a number of North Korean citizens you thought were sort of clustering up near the border?
We were in Pyongyang. Much of what we know about North Korea comes from dissidents and people who have left through the Chinese northern border, because that's sort of the only rational way to get out. You get killed in all the other paths, so you don't make it. And so by definition, they have a particular description of how the country works. So the sources of accurate information of how the government works are essentially nil. And I find it remarkable that in this day and age we know so little about the decision making and so forth. So I've since met with various North Korean scholars who have, for example, explained to me that there's an uncle and a mother and there's this complicated structure that the respected leader, as the new 29 or 30-year-old is known, that he has to kowtow to, and all sorts of discussions about the politics of the army. What in fact has happened is this fellow replaced all of the army generals that were beholden to his father upon his father's death by a new set of people. So the first rule of a dictator is get rid of the old guys and replace them by people who are completely loyal to you. And in the army, since all men of a certain age in North Korea seem to be in the army, is probably a pretty good first step if you're the dictator.
Archon's going to jump in just a minute with a series of questions, but let me deal a bit with the domestic side. Your first chapter, the opening, talking about the life of individuals. That actually was sort of the most promising, the brightest portrait that you painted, how life would change. And you use this just an example: someone getting up in the morning, and how many things would be different from how we're living now. Could you give us a sense of that? And then I had a follow-up question.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the future over the next 5 or 10 years for the developed world. And my experience is that people are still sort of figuring out how to use their phones. And so they're sort of surprised when you understand the rate at which this is improving. So over the next 5 or 10 years, these phones will become your personal assistants in ways that you cannot possibly imagine. This is all opt-in and with your permission and those sorts of things. But basically, because these are highly personal, they'll make suggestions to you. So simple ones like, leave now because there's a lot of traffic that'll happen in the next 30 minutes because we can model it and predict it.
They're able to figure out what the traffic is between where you and where you're going. Because it can
calculate and anticipate that using artificial intelligence techniques. That's pretty good. What about, here I'm in Boston, I don't know that many people. There are people in this room who share the same political views as you do. You'd like to meet them. Would they like to meet you? That's something that is easy to do. You can go through all of these. Another example is in your email, and again, this is opt-in. Your email, you've managed to do a reservation for an airplane, and it knows that you're always late. So it says, get in the car now, Eric. You're in big trouble because you allowed it to do that. Google Glass is this week becoming available to a limited set of developers. So I have one, and I've been playing with it, and it's the weirdest thing, right? You can have this little vision, and you can see things, and you can let your friends see what you're looking at. But that's not what was so impressive to me. What was impressive to me is that you talk to it. So you say Google Glass, and it says, hello, and it says that in your ear. And then you tell it it's query, it tells you the answer. And that's how good the voice recognition has gotten. So now imagine you have voice recognition plus 100 by 100 machine language translation, right? And all of a sudden we have a universal communicator, and we have the sort of Star Trek holodeck kind of a model. So all of that's going to happen in the next few years here. What happens after that? Well, this is more speculative, but there are many things. The most obvious ones are in medicine. Everyone's phone, which is attached to them. I mean, if I stole your phone right now, you'd have a conniption, right? You would, right? More important than stealing your wallet, probably, or your purse even, which I wouldn't do, because it would be recorded, right? It's a separate discussion. But the fact of the matter is that these devices are so personal that they'll be connected to our bodies in various ways. There are startups that are doing transdermal patches, which you put on, which Wi-Fi out what's going on in your blood, your body. There are pills, we talk about this in the book, that have been approved by the FDA that will Wi-Fi out what's going on inside your body, right? So that talks to the phone calls the doctor looks at it and then calls you back and says, get to the hospital now, you're about to die. This kind of preventive and aggressive medicine will help save lives. There are example after example. So here's another one. We walk into a room, there's going to be a whiteboard, and the whiteboard will be, in fact, a translucent LCD. And the LCD will notice that you and I are friends, or we know each other, and it'll say, you met him a year ago. This is what he disagrees with you on. This is what he said about you. And it'll do the same thing for you, or maybe not. So the point is that this sort of computer aiding of life makes us infinitely more productive and more creative, which is ultimately, I think, one of the solutions to economic growth and all the other things.
Well, I wondered about that, and let me finish up with that question, because it does occur that you get up and you have all these splendid things. You get ready to get in the car that is automatic and will drive you to wherever, but that you have no job to drive to. I mean, even if you're a college graduate, there may be a shortage of jobs because robots may do a lot of the work that college graduates have been doing. So
let me try an idea for this group. Let's imagine that this is a race, and it's a race between automation and creativity. Okay. Now, automation occurs all around us. It's occurring because of just economics and investment and so forth. So one of the things to worry about is look at China. China has all of these factories that are currently absorbing a lot of rural labor that used to work in the fields. Its life is much better in the factories than it was in the fields. Those people will be replaced by robots at some point, because it will be cheaper to roboticize what they're doing. The answer, of course, is creativity. So think of it as a race. Now, creativity means people coming up with new services, new manufacturing, new solutions to life, new entertainment, and so forth, and figuring out how to make money and grow the economy. How do you achieve creativity? Through education. Sort of what you guys do, right? Or critical thinking or knowledge. So the jobs that are at risk are the ones which that are easily roboticized over the next decade.
Yeah, but the early signs are not as encouraging as one might like.
Well, that's presumably because the American education system is not working hard enough, or the teaching system isn't working, or whatever, not producing it. People are very creative, and yet they're trapped in these sort of terrible jobs. Let's use self-driving cars. They're not really self-driving, you're driving them, right? So what is the impact of that? Well, maybe it affects limo drivers and so forth. We were joking that the correct thing to do is to put them in Saudi Arabia so they can drive the women around. That was a joke. Okay, solves the problem, right? You know, you guys have a ridiculous rule. We'll solve it with technology. We'll show you how stupid your rule is. So there's lots of things that happen when these technologies come along, but the fact of the matter is the reason that you care about a driver-assisted or self-driving car is because the car will drive itself better than you will, especially if you're drunk. So one of the terrible tragedies in America is there are about 30,000 deaths on highways a year in America. That number, by the way, on a per mile driven is the lowest it's ever been. So everyone's celebrating that. To me, I look at that, that's horrendous. 30,000 families that have lost a loved one. So if the self-driving cars are, a third, 3 times less deadly, think of the number of lives that would be saved. And ideally, they would be 0.
Archon.
Good. So I want to join David Elwood and David Gergen and thank you for writing such an excellent book. So the first thing, one phrase or thought that struck me in the book is that you say that right now we've talked to a lot of political officials, and you're not talking about Ben Ali or Mubarak, but U.S. political officials, and you say, well, they're not that technologically savvy right now, but in 5 or 10 years, they will be. Now, imagine that that's not true, and it might not be true if Google continues to pay young people several multiples of what they could make in government, and it might not be true if the Kennedy School doesn't kind of get it together with regard to the technology and digital education effort. Now, if it turns out not to be true, what would be lost? And one answer may be nothing, because Google and Facebook and Apple will take care of it, thank you very much. But what do you think? Would anything be lost?
Well, the question is whether you want government to be more efficient or not. If you view government's job as not particularly to deliver services, but rather to solve various political problems, paying off your supporters and so forth, then the last thing you want to do is automate it. Right? So in your theoretical case, which is clearly not going to occur because HKS is going to continue to generate excellent graduates, et cetera, you could imagine that the current status quo serves the current incumbencies. So technology threatens incumbencies because it makes them more efficient or holds them more accountable. So from a government perspective, governments can now actually measure outcomes. What a shock. So I'm a member of the President's Science Advisory Committee, and we do these reviews. And so this very serious woman came in to present her research on a particular form of medical treatment, that so forth, and she hands out her report. And I said, okay, well, is it online? And she said, no, we're not allowed to do that. Okay, that's interesting, it's not classified. And I said, well, how many people have read it? I said, well, I don't know. So how do you know that your work had any impact at all? Well, she defined her work as producing this report, which was quite well done, that no one read. Okay, now if that's what government is about, then we're not going to be very helpful. But to me, that it's the lie of government that if you believe government is supposed to be efficient, then you should measure government, including all the policy work and so forth. And I would venture that people in this room are going to find their work measured, judged based on influence using new analytics, and it's going to be important for you to be, to be influential, and there'll be a way of measuring it. So much of the way government in America has worked is not particularly rational, right? It was constructed because of lobbying, or because people made a contribution, or because of some company interest, or so forth.
Yeah, good. So there's a lot of great tensions in the book, and one of them is between marketing and collective intelligence. And you have this kind of 2 long discussions that kind of go in different ways. And one long discussion is about the danger of clever marketing on the internet that will spread out either false ideas or set priorities that are the wrong priorities. So Coney 2012 may be an example of this that you discuss. So that's one idea. And the second idea is that, well, what the internet really does is get good information, true information out there that allows, in particular, people to hold large organizations and governments accountable, right? And so those kind of go in 2 different directions. And so the question is, well, which is it? And then what can we do to torque the internet on a trajectory so that it tends toward more truth, less marketing and misinformation?
This, of course, is a core question. Google has a straightforward answer, which is this is a search problem, and we should rank these things correctly. So, but let's go through a fictional scenario involving, assume that smoking was just discovered to cause cancer, and there was a big debate. And again, so take us 50 years ago, but apply all the current information technology. So if you look at history, what the smoking companies did is they engaged in extremely aggressive marketing around the fact that these were falsehoods, that there were plots, that the government was out to get them, and so forth and so on. They would have played those all out on the internet. And it's in their financial interest as capitalists to mislead their customers to think that this scientific information is false, right? So they would do it, and they would do it aggressively and so forth. Meanwhile, these scientists who are sort of kooky anyway in their little white suits would say, no, that's not true, this whole wave is not true, and they would call up their friends and so forth, and they see people are dying, and then the healthcare profession would get its act together, and then eventually people would write this, and eventually it would sort itself out. Now, the quicker that fight occurs, the quicker we get to the answer that we want, which is, of course, smoking does cause cancer. That little scenario, which I picked precisely because it's not current, is being played out today in enormous numbers of ways. And the ones you want to be careful about are the ones where there's a vested interest in lying. So who has a vested interest in lying? Okay, a fair number of people. Dictators, political people who want to sort of bend the truth to get reelected, corporations who don't have standards around this sort of stuff, and where it's legal to say whatever you want. So my conclusion is check another source. There's a reason why Snopes.com was invented. You know, when you read stuff, like yesterday the stock market went down and up for 5 minutes over a single Twitter post. Didn't they like check another source before they sold? Is it so powerful that a single sentence can do that? It's extraordinary. Yeah. And it's just a password hack.
Right. Just a couple more questions and then we'll open it up. One great insight and image in the book is of not one internet, but many, many internets. And so there's a description of the halal internet created by attempted to be created by the Iranian government. And then you imagine kosher internet. But then there are also internet, you might think of the American internet as a specific internet that some might say is a ad-driven internet, and then you might think of the European internet as a privacy-protecting internet. So the question is, two questions: who's got the best internet, and then how can we learn from these different internets that are emerging in order to ourselves create the best internet?
The most exciting announcement this week was the Iranian announcement that they're going to do their own Google Earth. And this Google Earth will omit Israel. This is real progress, right? That was facetious, guys. Do not
tweet that out.
Do not tweet that out is what I actually believe. That was a joke. Sorry. Okay. I mean, what craziness is this? Yeah. Right? These guys are crazy. Right? You delete a country because you don't like it on the map, right? And yet this is the kind of thinking that goes on. So I use that, it's both true, but also kind of farcical. So it's sort of embarrassing to them if they actually cared, which they obviously don't, that we're in great danger of governments deciding to filter, delete, or otherwise alter the shared resource that is the internet. There are on the order of 35 countries that are doing various forms of filtering or content deletion. The best known is China. Iran is making a lot of talk about it, doing it. Governments can, in fact, do this, and the way they do this is the internet, of course, has interconnection points between countries. They can put what are technically known as proxy caches, which they can then filter or otherwise delete things, or they can simply not allow in. For much of the Muslim world, YouTube is banned much of the time because of some of the content that's on that. Facebook and YouTube, for example, are not available in China, and they have their own services, which are somewhat more regulated and somewhat more censored than the American equivalent, and perhaps that promotes local economy as well. So imagine a scenario where under the rise of it's a slippery slope. So everyone in this room agrees that child pornography is really a bad thing. Everyone in this room believes that children should be protected. That makes perfect sense. So the Russians wrote a bill, which was passed last month, which is the Child Protection Act on the internet. Well, the things that they ban on the internet look like an awful lot like criticism of Mr. Putin, who apparently is being criticized like a child, right? That's the only conclusion you can come to. Or perhaps they're just marketing using the claim that children need to be protected, which is we're not in dispute, to actually provide a censorship regime. And the penalties are severe, and the rules are unclear. So our position, and I think everyone in the room will agree, is that it's better to answer the speech problem with more speech and more connectivity. It's relatively easy to see how segments of the internet will actually just balkanize. right, if this continues. And that would be a terrible, terrible step for global everything, really.
Good. Okay, last question, and then I'll...
Go ahead, no, I'm going to watch
Oh, okay, and then we'll open it up.
Good.
So this one puts you on the spot a little bit. So imagine a scenario in which you're 100% certain that some change to the Google search algorithm will improve American democracy, either by reducing the amount of misinformation, or if you think polarization is the problem, will get people of extreme political persuasions to see each other's point of view. Imagine you had 100% confidence in that tweak. Would you change the Google search algorithm, or that's not Google's business to be improving democracy in that way?
Well, we see ourselves as ranking facts, right? So if it caused ranking to become better, we would do it. If it caused ranking to become less accurate, we wouldn't do it. The algorithmic questions are never framed in that question. They're framed in the testing that we do of when people see the answer, does it appear to them to be more accurate? And we can measure that. One of the core problems at Google is we don't have an absolute truth meter. There isn't an Oracle, sorry for the joke, Oracle.
He's not here.
Right. You can't, we don't have a way of knowing something in an absolute sense in the way that you know facts.
Yeah.
So it's at some basic level, our algorithm is an approximation. Now, it's a very good algorithm. And the way our search algorithm, for those of you who don't know, is it starts from well-known sites, and then it uses a calculation that's now well understood to look at influence. And so we start, by the way, at the top universities, which are seen as, this is the part of the role that Harvard plays, we start at the top universities because it's seen that the activities in universities are likely to be more truthful than in other places. You can determine if that's an appropriate starting point, but the sum of it tends to produce the right answer. David?
Okay. As you know, we have a tradition that we don't sell books at an event like this, but we do encourage people to find books. And so we've taken an idea from the Huffington Post, where how you can get a book. Eric has signed 10 books, all right? And what we ask, if you want to get a book from Eric, you can write a response to the following set of questions and send it in. The best 10 responses will get books, okay? And this is what, in the book, they predict, he and Jared predict that there'll be about 5 billion new connected people online here in the coming years. And so the question is this, as you think about the next 5 billion to come online, what makes you excited? What scares you? What changes do you foresee in the near future that could pose the greatest threats to our security, as well as the greatest opportunities for freedom and connectedness? Take any of that, write something up. You can be among the top 10. Send a short response to this email address. We'll give it one more time before we leave. cplidea@gmail.com. And you can have your own.
This is not Yahoo or Hot.
Yeah.
And by the way, in the book, we start with I think perhaps the most important point, which is in the next 5 years, 5 billion people are going to join our conversation through the advent of these smart web browsers. It's going to be a wild ride.
It's going to be a wild ride. Now, I want to have one short series of questions regarding national security, and then we'll open this up. I came back from a conversation earlier this week, I'll get that, thank you, with several former secretaries of defense here in the United States. They shared some very deep concerns about the national security picture. There were 3 that were very much on their mind. One was what they felt was a growing danger of terrorism, as there are new terrorist cells and havens in North Africa. The second was cyber attacks, which is a serious problem for CEOs and big companies around this country. And for many of them, it's a #1 concern they have right now. And the third was drones. And if you could, walk us through a little bit, because you have a lot about national security. Jared spent a lot of time working on this in the past. Walk us through those issues as you see them.
I think the first comment is that there have always been crazy people, crazy splinter groups, and so forth. It's probably harder in North Africa to recruit your followers when they are online and they discover it's you, Joe, and Harry, as opposed to the thousands of followers that you claim to have that you've just made up to recruit your people. So a little bit of doubt for the citizens of these countries might make it a little harder to recruit people into these things, maybe not. So that's a hope there.
And we ought to be using our soft power to improve the possibility, help the good guys.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right. But independent of what we do, they're going to get connected because it's in their interest to do so.
Right.
And as long as their governments don't completely balkanize the net, those people will have access to information that will give them an alternative view. As to whether they exercise it or whether they get radicalized, that's a question for you all to debate. The second point you asked was about cyber war, and I think the current state of cyber threats, if you will, are that China is one of the countries that are doing it, but there's evidence that others are doing it as well. There's evidence that Iran is doing it. There's evidence that Russia is doing it. There's evidence that Israel is doing it. There's some of the Western countries, and there's certainly press reporting that the United States is doing it. So it's certainly not just a Chinese problem. The Chinese attacks have been primarily of two kinds. One is intellectual property theft, which is what Google went through a few years ago, and the other is sort of testing, seeing how far they can go. Nobody knows what the next step is. It's perfectly possible, for example, that the United States and China can have great cooperations on many things and then have this little cyber fight that's sort of perpetual.
So you have a war going on in the virtual world.
You have a virtual war, but not in the physical world.
Yeah.
And so one of the sort of thought experiments is you go through the Dr. Strangelove scenario, where you have the crazy general in China who's having a good time with his cyber war, and all of a sudden he takes down the water system or the power system or the electric grid of one key part of America by mistake. So then you go through, okay, so the president of China calls up the president of the United States and says, oh, sorry, we were just kidding, he wasn't authorized to do that, on a program that they've denied they ever had. So you can play these, it's worth, and I think you all should spend some time thinking about it, go through the game theory of what happens in these scenarios. Nobody, I think, has really thought through what happens when the virtual stuff that's going on leaks in by force, by accident, or other reasons into the physical world, and then how would we respond? I don't know the answer to that. In drones, we do talk about drones in the book at some length, and it's obvious that drones exist, even if the US doesn't talk about it very much. It's obvious that there will be other countries that will have drones that are militarized, and there are a huge number of moral and ethical issues around their use, how do you hold people accountable, and so forth, which have been heavily debated. The digital component of this is the democratization of everything. Mm-hmm. So the democratization of manufacturing, of information, of television, of media also means the democratization of drones, right? So at that point, you have a question of regulation and access and so forth. How would you feel if your neighbor had a drone and you didn't like your neighbor? That sort of question. In America, there are in fact rules about that, but there won't be necessarily rules in every country. Yeah.
But the dilemma that seems to arise is, and you see this as a civil libertarian, that the only people in this country right now who have the capability of really holding off cyber attacks are in the military, especially the National Security Agency. And the people who are best equipped to handle domestic terrorism, especially with weapons of mass destruction, are again the military. And we've had a tradition since Reconstruction of keeping the military out of domestic affairs, called posse comitatus. But yet, if the only people who can really protect you, how do we strike that balance? Because there's going to be a natural tendency to say, well, let's bring the military into this. And there are privacy questions that arise on that, questions of balance of power, questions that are pretty significant.
In general, I think these questions have not been resolved, as you pointed out. I can tell you that when you're attacked in cyberspace, the law requires you to call the FBI. So you call the FBI, and a very nice FBI agent comes, and they immediately call other aspects of the federal government, which include the NSA and other aspects, because that's where the competency is.
Right.
And I think that's where we are. I think the reality is that there will, in fact, be various low-grade kinds of cyber crimes for a long time. We're working very hard to strengthen our defenses, and I suspect that people like the FBI and so forth will have significant growth in those areas. To express a little bit of caution here, people are working extremely hard to strengthen the critical infrastructure of America. So the reason people like myself talk about electric grid attacks or banking system attacks is to make sure that everybody is talking about this, because the way you solve these problems is not by secrecy, but rather by talking about it. Because people say, oh, I forgot, I have a computer over there that's unsecured. In the book, we actually talk about an idea from Craig Mundy that you would, in fact, the ISPs would take a computer that was known to be sort of infected and quarantine it virtually. That the legality will ultimately require that. Because we can't have rogue computers in the same way we can't have rogue humans wandering around these networks with being infected and being used by other people.
Let's open this up. There are 2 microphones here. If you please identify yourself as you come to the microphone. Or are you going to hand these out rather than coming to the microphone? All right. And if you would, as we do with all Kennedy School events, 1 question per customer, and a question ends with a question mark. And please identify yourself.
Hello, so my name is Luis. I am a student here at Kennedy School, graduating in May, very soon. And one thing, what you were talking about was that when people join the conversation, when they collect information, they collect knowledge, and they use tools like Google to understand and categorize the knowledge, or Wikipedia to find a common ground of a certain version of knowledge. It's one thing, but another thing is having the access to the data a great company like Google has, or companies like telecommunications companies and so forth. So one of the ideas we've been debating here at the Kennedy School is the idea of a data commons. So I was just like to hear what you think about it, if it's feasible, what the advantages for companies like Google and so forth.
How would the data commons work?
With people like Google joining it up with other huge companies and sort of giving it up some of the market advantage, but at the same time trying to find some common ground.
I can't imagine that our users would want us randomly contributing information about them, their patterns, and so forth to anyone, let alone a data commons.
Right.
I mean,
well, they opt into Google services, so they could opt into data commons.
I cannot. I mean, again, I understand the idea is a clever one, but I can't imagine that our customers, the end users, would be okay. People are already concerned. They want to make sure that their queries, their usage patterns, or so forth. I've argued in the past internally that we do in fact have this. We could build marketing businesses, but even an anonymized marketing business, where the information is fully anonymized, is seen as so dangerous from a perception perspective. So people care a great deal about the privacy of their information, and I doubt that you're going to see much of that for things which are personal in nature.
Right. Thank you.
Good, yes.
Hello, hello. My name is Emmanuel Severin. I'm a MBP student here from France, and there is a sense in my country that people should have a right to be forgotten.
Yes.
So to give an example,
I'm in favor of that too.
Okay.
That was a joke.
Well, but then I would like to hear your thoughts about it. To give an example, if you're 15 years old or 20 years old and you commit a crime, and you pay your debt to society, you spend 5 years, 10 years in prisons, you think you should have the right 15 years, 20 years, or 30 years down the road not to have your past appearing on a Google search whenever your employer or somebody that want to rent you a house look for your name?
So it's a very good question. And in the book we talk about a sort of simple feature of this new world, which is the absence of a delete button. And in our conversations with people, most people are not very sympathetic to the adult scenario. In other words, if you've committed a crime as part of a historical record, most people want adults to be aware of that. So a warning to anybody who wishes to be a criminal, that history is going to be known forever for the rest of your life and will be used against you. That was always true, but it's much more searchable now because the public records were always true. To me, the problem is much more severe with teenagers. I'll give you an example. Here in America, if you're a juvenile and you go to juvenile court and you do a relatively minor crime, you can actually, once you're adult, petition to have that crime eliminated, and you can honestly answer saying you were never convicted of anything. So today, you do that, and then you go to the employer who does a search on the internet, and here's all the records, and you have said, I never committed a crime, which you can legally do. So now you look like a liar, even though you followed exactly how the system has worked. The society has not worked this out. So my own view of this is that each country will come up with a different solution. There's a European initiative under Nellie Kroes which is known as the right to be forgotten. And we've talked to them about this. We don't exactly know how to implement it, right? So if I'm pictured with somebody else, do they get deleted but because they wanted to be forgotten, but I'm kept in the picture? If there's a reference to me, what is an appropriate reference versus a non-reference? In other words, the principle makes some intellectual sense, but no one has yet proposed how to implement a right to be forgotten, given this tendency of these technologies to, and because of aggregation and because of the legal processes and so forth. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name's Diane Chang. I'm a second-year student here and a former journalist. Thank you so much for being here today, Mr. Schmidt. So I'm interested in how Google wants to get into or continue to develop the role that you play in information transmission to users beyond just answering specific search queries. When Google announced that Reader was getting shut down, there was such a collective, outcry of despair on all of my social media among my friends. So how do you view the future of how information should be delivered, beyond social sharing, beyond using RSS feeds, I guess, is something you guys have decided is not worth pursuing. So what does that look like, and what do you think Google's role is in the future of information dissemination?
Well, the sort of core presumption here is that people will have personalized or personally identified accounts where they've chosen to log in. Google Plus does this, and you'll get your information through feeds through those mechanisms as opposed to through RSS feeds. RSS was a tremendous technology from 15 years ago. It's sort of really simple scripting, I think, is the way it worked. And so they're just newer technologies coming along, and that's sort of what drove that. What I would suggest is that the real thing you want is not a feed, but rather an AI algorithm that knows roughly what you care about and is looking all the time to select the best and most interesting feeds. And we're on the cusp of being able to do that technologically, based on your preferences and using machine intelligence and data mining. And if Google doesn't do it, other people will.
I think so. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael. I'm a junior at the college. Thanks for being here.
Does that mean that you're an undergraduate?
Yes.
Thank you.
I want to ask you a glass question.
Of course.
How do you think, or do you think, that glass will change the way we interact face to face? Like, do you think we're going to become paranoid? And do you think we should give up on privacy in the age of glass?
We're just shipping these products this week, and we're acutely aware of that question, of those questions. So we have, as part of Glass, we have a set of rules around we have to approve the applications and so forth. So we want to be very careful that this sort of new invention is not misused. I mean, for example, it's already been banned in Las Vegas casinos. They haven't even seen it. Now they ban all cameras because they don't want card counting. So I suppose there's some logic to that. You don't imagine, here I'm in the casino doing my cards with my Google glasses on. I mean, I can understand that argument. But I'm always concerned about premature regulation based on fear as opposed to understanding what's possible. The people who've used Glass, including myself, sort of reported it as remarkable. So I'd like to let it get a little bit farther of a runway before we characterize it in the obvious ways. I would argue, for example, that we will invent new social etiquette. So if you and I are wearing glass, maybe we'll have some protocol where I'll say, take your glasses off. Or I'll say, I am turning mine on. I mean, society adapts to these new things. And wearable computing is very much a real thing, of which glass is just one example. Years ago, I said that you'd have 5 IP addresses, attached to your body in some way. Here's one, right? There'll be others as well. Doing things that make your life more interesting. And we'll have to have rules about how you use them, and they may literally be just etiquette. What's appropriate, what's not. There's obviously places where Google Glass is not appropriate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Judith Fagan. I'm a graduating mid-career here at the Kennedy School. My question is around your 5 billion person wild ride and the infrastructure. Danny Hillis, who's head of Applied Minds, who you may know.
Very well.
Danny's a great guy.
Absolutely brilliant man.
Brilliant. So Danny did a TED Talk last month about Plan B. So my question is, as you probably know, Plan B is Danny's thesis that the internet at some point is going to explode, implode, stop working somehow. And what about having a Plan B where lower level users such as police, fire, education can work at a different level, not unlike, I guess, pencil and paper. So that's one thing. What do you think about Plan B?
Let's just answer that. As brilliant as Danny is, that's a particular conjecture of the future that may or may not happen. What we know now is the world is getting interconnected, and we know that the routing and transport algorithms are highly resistant to attack. So these scenarios where the internet collapse scenarios, which have been present for 20 years, we've managed to forestall them. So for example, 10 years ago, there was a great debate that the DNS servers, of which there were 13 at the time, would somehow be attacked simultaneously. The namespace of the entire internet would fall apart and everyone would die. right, or some variant of that. Well, there were many reasons why this scenario was false, but in fact, the conversation spurred them to change the number of DNS servers, harden the infrastructure, and make it pretty much impossible. If you take a look at the way in which cookies and various certificates are written in browsers, there's a browsing hierarchy of permissions, and they have a collapse point, which is that there's a senior node. So algorithms have been changed more recently so that you verify that, so that you know you're not collapsing and that no one has stolen it. There was a famous Iranian, maybe a graduate student or maybe the government, who took over the country of Denmark for a short period of time by rerouting all the certificates through Iran, right, fixed in the browser. So there's examples like that over and over again. So I'm much more skeptical about these broad claims because I see the human ingenuity. The internet has resisted every form of attack, including from governments, for 45 years.
Well, that takes care of the second part of
Go
the
ahead.
question, because the second part was going to be, if Plan B was feasible here, couldn't that be Plan A in the developing world that perhaps would give them a more level playing field and better access?
So there are teams that are building peer-to-peer internet scenarios that go something like this. You have a phone and I have a phone. He has a phone, she has a phone. We can now do multipath routing, right? And we can essentially have our own internet, which is not controllable by the telco or the state. The chips in the phones are frequency agile enough now that you could actually do this if you can steal enough frequency to do it. In some countries this is illegal, in some countries it's legal. We already see evidence of people using Bluetooth networks, so you use Bluetooth doesn't go very far, so it has to be very next neighbor. So there's lots of examples of peer-to-peer backup solutions that if the centralized part of the internet were to fall apart, which I think is unlikely, highly unlikely, like very, very unlikely, like not going to happen.
Have you told Danny that?
But if that were to occur, we have some good technological solutions.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brandon Moore. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School, and really appreciate your remarks. I have a BS in electrical engineering, and I'm a tech nerd, so I really closely follow your activities at Google. And so you laid out this alluring vision of the future that Google, could provide to us in terms of self-driving cars and predictive technologies. And it seems like it's wonderful, but it's also facilitating a problematic trend in capitalism, which is increasing efficiency leads to less need for people. And so my question for you is, what role can Google play in helping individuals sort of keep their position within the economy? And the obvious response is education. And that's great for the younger folks. But for the folks like, say, my mom or something who's like...
Hey, what are you saying about old people?
Well, I'm going to finish.
Your mom's probably younger than I am.
Well, I guess the point is there a role for this predictive technology in helping people stay ahead of the curve, like getting an alert and saying, hey, your skills have atrophied or something like that?
Let's go back to our British history and the invention of the loom. Right, so we had a major problem. We're sitting here at Harvard. Harvard was around back then, and we had this major problem that someone's figured out, the sort of mechanical loom, that is going to cause a jobless problem for the people who are hand shearing and looming and sort of assembling fiber. The economic history of this is actually not very good. That what happened was young people, yourself, right, ended up building businesses in loom, transforming. It was a predecessor to the Industrial Revolution. There's a long history of that. It was quite fascinating. And the people who were skilled in the older skill never retrained. Right? So this is not a new problem. And what politicians do is they say, let's create an education fund and we'll retrain these older people. So what the older people really do is they go to the government and they get more support, or they get balkanized protection against the new industry, which is the more likely scenario. So I worry about the inverse, which is that the incumbencies, the sort of the older people, will stop the innovation, which ultimately will drive your productivity, your generation's lead. So I worry about the inverse. And having said that, I would argue that Google can help because Google is free. And if you have lost your job, and it's always a bad situation, there's tremendous resources for you if you would just stop watching the TV, get online, try to figure out how to learn something new, start to get a job, et cetera. YouTube, for example, is full of information on this, and in fact, you can take entire graduate courses on everything on YouTube I'm a member of something called the Khan Academy, which is a self-teaching. So there's lots and lots of resources that our prototypical Loom displaced people can learn from that they didn't have 150 years ago.
Well, from British looms to a British question. My name's Casper Tekyle. I'm a joint degree student here at the Kennedy School and the Divinity School. I'm going to follow up on Michael's question because I was left somewhat unsatisfied. Okay. Technology changes culture. We know this from the domestication of the horse or the printing press. When you're at the forefront of choosing which technologies are going to shape our culture, when you're choosing which technologies to invest in, do you think about the side effects of how this is going to change culture? And you talked a little bit about etiquette. For example, half of the students, myself included, are on our phones or on email during class. We're still struggling to figure out these new etiquettes. I'm sorry to rat on everyone, but that's the case. But it's changing the way we interact with one another. And I just wondered, is that in your business planning? Do you consider these questions in depth when you're launching something new?
We do, although I would say that we're no better at predicting the human sociological impacts than anybody else. What we're good at is inventing devices that are useful, pieces of hardware and software, and we try them. And we're acutely aware, as was discussed earlier, of the privacy concerns. I give a very clear answer there, or the business or regulatory concerns. But we also don't see ourselves as the censors over human behavior. So if we invent Google Glass and it's highly useful to you, we would probably prefer to give it to you and have you experiment with it in a socially appropriate way than to self-censor and say, we have this neatest thing and we're just going to give it to ourselves. That doesn't seem to serve we'll only have self-driving cars that drive us around. That doesn't seem like the right mission for the company. Our goal is to make the world better. We'll take the criticism along the way, and the criticisms are inevitably from people who are afraid of change, or who have not figured out that there will be an adaptation of society to it. My favorite example is that I actually like people to talk to me when I talk to them. This is apparently an old phenomenon. So at Google, when I was CEO for 10 years, we had a rule that you had to turn off your computer and you actually had to look at each other in the meeting for 60 minutes, one time a week. 60 minutes, once a week.
Was it hard?
How did that go?
It was so hard. It was so hard that people would take their mobile devices and they'd go like this under the table, and I would walk around and look for them, and we would find them money for this, and we would do everything. We couldn't, even 1 hour per week, you couldn't have a civilized conversation. So when Larry replaced me, he gave up, and now I sit in the meeting typing away like everybody else. There's no eye contact. So if you like eye contact, I'm sorry, you lost.
Thanks. That's a phenomenal story.
Mr. Schmidt, thank you very much for being here. My name is Jian. I am a current Googler and a MPP1 student.
Excellent.
And on behalf of the 10 North Korean defectors we invited to the Illicit Networks conference last summer, I want to say thank you so much for your interest in bringing connectivity to the country. My question has to do with incentivizing autocrats in these regimes such as North Korea, Belarus, Eritrea, to bring internet to their country. How can they be incentivized? How does it benefit them? These are, as we all know, autocrats who depend on closed information borders. And if that's not possible in the short term, should we rely on more creative measures like the shadow internet or other alternatives?
The days of these autocrats are numbered, because courageous people are going to create illicit communications networks that will ultimately topple them. People want to communicate. These closed systems will fall. I don't know when. It may be decades, but there won't be new ones, and the old ones will fall. People are just not going to stand for it anymore. When we were in South Sudan, we heard the story of how do you get information into the war zone between Sudan and South Sudan. There are these terrible atrocities going on there, and people have no information at all. There's no internet or anything. They smuggle the information in on micro SD cards. They literally sit there reading the information on an 8 gig micro SD card on their phone. That's how desperate people are. And I used the previous examples of Bluetooth and so forth. I'm personally aware of initiatives that are not yet public, where people are in fact going to hack phones and add other base stations to be able to do exactly the kind of scenario. So we don't say this when we visit with the people in these countries because we don't want to forewarn them. But I think we can say with some certainty that it'll go one way or the other. They'll either, as in the case of the Myanmar generals, for whatever set of reasons, they'll choose to open the country, or they'll be forced to open the country by a revolution. I think there's only two paths.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Schmidt. My name is Mark Fang. I'm from the business school, and I'm proud to say I'm also an electrical engineering student from UC Berkeley. So I have a personal question for you. I spent a lot of time working in China, especially as an engineer, and before Google left China, I knew that for millions of Chinese, Google was the beacon of the light. It offered hope for a lot of people, and there was the notion of information, and there's Google's information, and we know which one is always more reliable. So when Google left China, the American part of me felt that was an incredibly brave decision, because you're giving up so much market. It was an incredible move. But the Chinese part of me felt that in some ways, Google may have turned up the light for a lot of people who depended on that information to see the world in a different light. So my question is, I would love to hear about, as you made that tremendously difficult decision, how you balanced the ideals of America and the ideal of the Western world and Google's principle against the reality of what you have to do to work in China.
I think you've epitomized the debate that we had perfectly. And it was one of the toughest decisions inside the company. And the decision was not made in unanimity. Normally, everybody agrees to what we're up to. But legitimate people disagree on this point. As we debated and debated. But the fact of the matter is we had been attacked, quite in our view, violently by the Chinese government. And we knew who did it. By the way, we knew it was from them because they didn't work on the weekends. It was a professional attack. Now, come on, hackers work on the weekends. Come on. A good hacker, you work at Saturday night. I understand hackers very well. They had gone after dissidents in America in particularly bad ways through Gmail and others, and that's occurred since, and we're very upset about that. And then the third was that the demands of censorship were becoming so offensively and oppressive, and the details are illegal to reveal, but let me just summarize that you would get a phone call, and they'd say, take this information down immediately, and the information is typically about a political leader, the son's arrested, or that kind of thing. You see, and this has only gotten worse. So we couldn't take it, right? So in the theory that engagement is better than estrangement, which I believe, there's a point at which engagement violates too many of your own principles that you can't remain engaged, and that's the point that we got to. And it was a very difficult decision.
Hi, my name is John, and I'm an MPA student at the Kennedy School. I'm originally from New York, but I spent the last decade living and working in South Korea for the American State Department at Embassy Seoul. And regardless of what side of the camp you fall on, there are benefits to talking to the North Korean leadership. However, he chose not to meet with you, and yet gleefully met with Dennis Rodman.
I'm obviously not a very good basketball player.
So that begs the question, do you use what he responds to? And so if he chooses not to meet with you, a leader of one of the best or biggest companies in the world, but opts for the worm, if you could harness the collective power of Google search, and perhaps you can, who would you include on a delegation to meet Kim Jong-un, and why?
I'm, again, going back to this earlier comment, my view of North Korea is that it's better to have people talking to them than not talking to them. Because these people they have nuclear weapons and they're isolated. So a scenario where you have isolated people, they can make the wrong decision. If you go back to the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, things were so bad that they couldn't communicate, so they installed this red phone. It's hard for you all to imagine. They had to install this red telephone in the White House, right? So they could actually talk to each other to avoid nuclear war. So you're better off having communications. And what I don't know, and we don't know, is whether under classified conversations that are really occurring between the various governments. Maybe you know because you worked in the embassy, but you probably can't talk about it. So the fact of the matter is more communication is good. Now, sort of the dream team, given this gentleman's growing up in Switzerland and so forth, he's probably a fan of American athletes and actors and actresses. So I take a bunch of them, pick based on his age, pick the top 30-year-old actress and 30-year-old actor, right? So let's do it scientifically, based on age. And then some other people who he would admire, along with some very clever diplomats.
Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Schmidt. My name is Maria Davidenko. I'm a second-year master's in public policy student at the Kennedy School. I want to go back to your comments about Google Glass. You mentioned that I guess Google is actually going to be vetting the applications that are used by Glass. So what I wanted to ask was, I mean, given kind of Google's open source, no walled gardens credo, I mean, how do you balance that against technologies that are increasingly intimate with humans?
Well, this is indeed why we made this choice. As you know, with Google, with our Android market, we chose the other approach. But there, the standards are well understood, the social rules are well understood. We don't have a major problem with bad things getting uploaded. People will, when they notice something bad is uploaded, we take it down immediately. It looks a lot like our YouTube policy, which is if violent videos are uploaded and we're notified, we take them down immediately because they're against our terms of service. So that makes sense to us. With Google Glass, because it's so new, we decided to be more cautious. And I think it's always easier to open it up rather than to restrict it in the future, depending on what we see coming in. The proposals that we've seen of applications are fantastic. So let's just see. Give us a little bit of time. Let's not prejudge a product which is just this week getting to developers. Right? Let's give it a little bit of time to see what human ingenuity around the world can do and really make the world a better place, which is our goal.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ian, and I'm a sophomore undergraduate studying computer science. And I wanted to talk to you about Google Fiber.
Sure.
Because I thought it was interesting that it seems to me like the last part in a vertical monopoly that Google has over the web. Because, you know, Google makes browsers, Google makes web services, Google now makes hardware with phones and, you know, the Chromebooks. And now Google is actually the ISP as well. So I was wondering, one, do you foresee any political problems with, you know, having that type of vertical monopoly? And two, will there be any service advantages to having Google Fiber along with all these products? Because, you know, now I have, my Chrome is better because I use Google Web Services, but will the internet actually improve those services as well?
It won't surprise you that I disagree with your framing of the word monopoly. So, if I could rephrase your question without the word monopoly, I would answer it by saying that we did the Kansas City experiment. We've now added 2 more cities, which are Austin and Provo, to show that it's possible to build capacity unconstrained, volume unbilled, gigabit internets that go right to your home. And you as a computer scientist understand that you would move to one of these 3 cities because the bandwidth from your home to the data center is equal to the bandwidth from the terminal that you're using to manage the servers that you're programming on. Right. I mean, to me, this is like the neatest thing possible. And there's all sorts of startups that have in fact clustered in the places where this fiber has been installed because they want to run their online businesses from there. So we're seeing this effect already. So it's too early to tell exactly what we're going to do business-wise, but I think we're proving the point. What's great about the Austin announcement is that within 1 minute or 2 minutes of our announcing it, AT&T announced that they were going to also offer a gigabit. So the industry, which has typically not had a lot of competition, does respond to competition, and that's how you get great value. With respect to the other aspects, if you look at Chrome, we work very hard to make the web faster, and in fact our DNS servers, which you understand what those things are, and so forth, serve everybody equally. We have a Google Fast Internet project, which actually speeds up all of the access to the internet, not just Google. So we've worked hard to make the internet faster for everyone. In Africa, our proxy caches speed up everyone, including Facebook and so forth. We've taken the mission that the internet solves most problems, and a faster internet solves more problems. Now, this is obviously in our interest because faster internet, broadband internet, people click on ads more, there's more e-commerce, but that's a corollary effect to our primary mission. And one of the great things about working at Google is I can truthfully tell you that this is what we run the company for and not particularly earnings or revenue growth. We actually believe this stuff. And I can say that because it's true.
Great, thank you.
Hi, I'm Jean Deitch. I'm finishing a master's here at Kennedy. I'm former CEO of Mobile Robots, Inc., which commercialized some of Sebastian's early indoor navigation.
Excellent.
I'm interested to know what Ray Kurzweil and Isaac Dietz are up to.
Well, first place, Ray is very good at saying what he's working on, except for his current projects at Google, where he's just started. Ray, of course, is from Boston, is one of the foremost thinkers about the future. And let me just say that Google, from Ray's perspective, because I spent a fair amount of time with him, has some of the best AI, data mining, and complex computational capabilities that you'll ever find in the world. we're very, very proud of. And we have built those things, and that's an opportunity for him to try out some of the new ideas that he's thinking about.
And Isaac Dietz?
That's all I'm going to say.
Oh.
Google is very good about not pre-announcing things we haven't built yet.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Soffin. I worked on Google Fiber with Minnie and then Milo.
Excellent.
So I can talk to you after the talk. But one of my questions, I'm now a first year at Harvard Business School. What do you think is the best way to get more internet access out to more people? And we kind of talked about the mobile-to-mobile situation in regimes that don't allow the web, but what about wired access to people in this country that don't have it, or mobile access in emerging markets?
So I think most people who are not wired today will remain not wired. The economics of wired, with the exception of very wealthy places, are going to mean fiber to the towers and then 4G or Wi-Fi towers. So when we visit these countries, we explain that the predominant model is get fiber to your city, ideally multiple fiber providers, and then have a competitive process for telecommunications carriers where they compete in various forms of bandwidth and so forth, and they provide good value. The reason we say this with such certainty is that in many countries, the telecommunications industry is the fastest growing, most profitable, and largest employer of legal employers in these countries. Right. So for example, Somalia, right? This turns out to be true because even the bad guys like to talk to each other and they'll pay their mobile bills, which is sort of shocking. So the fact of the matter is that the internet as a data service over the wires is how most people will get it. In America and in Europe, you're going to see these fiber projects, but they're going to be difficult to do in rural areas for the same reasons that it's always the homes passed calculation. Right. One of the good news is that most of the world is moving rural to city, and aside from the fact that the cities are the traffic is becoming terrible, people are getting in skyscrapers, right, of one form or another, and those skyscrapers are perfect for this fiber vision. If you spend any time in South Korea or Tokyo, you see what the future will hold, and it would make your mouth water as a person here in terms of what they can do with bandwidth.
Especially a person that likes fiber.
That's right.
Why don't we finish up with the questions? Yeah, sure. The folks that are standing.
Okay, terrific. Sir, thank you so much for coming. It's, I think, a real honor for all of us to get to listen to you. My name's Catherine Clem. I'm a second-year Master in Public Policy student here at the Kennedy School. I think most of us in the room want to make change in some way, and won't come as a surprise to anyone, right, that so often there will be resistance to the change that we hope and seek for the world. Since technology and change often are inextricably linked to one another, I think you are probably one of the best people in the world to answer this question. How can we best cultivate a receptivity to change, whether it be in the space of technology or in policy or other fields? How can we break through some of that resistance we find?
Transparency is usually the right answer. I don't know the answer of once everybody knows what's going on, the system doesn't change. That's a time when the voters will revolt or people will revolt against the incumbents. But I always start with this notion of people have to know what's really going on. Secrecy is often used to prevent you from getting access to what you need, especially in governments. Sir.
Hello, my name is Haitham Al-Salama. I'm a second-year MPP student at the Kennedy School. Google Health went offline very recently, and with 5 billion people joining the conversation very soon, what is Google's next thing on healthcare?
The Google Health project was not as successful as we wanted because of the complexity of dealing with the MIS systems and regulation issues and so forth. So we decided to sort of try other things. At the moment, what Google is focusing mostly on is making sure that the medical information that we present you is accurate and is excerpted properly. So if you type in any form of medical disease or the name of a medical disease, you'll see now a medical one box which will actually come up from legitimate sources and tell you a little bit about it and point you. We're very, very, very focused on making sure that that first result is the right one, because we certainly don't want you taking the wrong approach. And that's been our primary focus.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm Tuan Nguyen. I'm Associate of Sovereignty Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy, Kennedy School here, and board member of Boston Global Forum. And how Google contribute to reduce terrorism in the world today. I would like to know that
So how can Google
reduce? Can contribute and support to reduce terrorism in the world today. Terrorism.
Yes, reducing terrorism. I think my general answer is what I answered before, which is that giving people choices of worldviews, doing automatic translation so that you see not just one language, but everybody, you see the sum of the world's knowledge and not just the knowledge in your own language. You know, the obvious ones, Arabic to English translation, Chinese to Arabic translation, that kind of stuff. That's probably the biggest impact we have, because it allows people to have doubt, to see choices, to form their own opinions. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that we probably do.
Hi, I'm Avner. I'm a mid-career here in the Kennedy School. And over the last year, we've heard several heads of state in this school, and I think you were the most powerful one.
Very nice to hear.
And my question is about that. Google has immense power that in the past only belonged to governments. And most of the stuff that you have discussed is not about technology, but about policy and about taking care of the people. However, you're not an elected official. So how do you balance that, and where do you take your responsibility from? And is there a limit to the power of Google should have, or other companies like that?
Well, I try to remind people that we are not a government and we don't have guns. And I think the power and the arrogance of my side of the world is limited by the pistol, right? That ultimately governments can stop the forces that we are talking about by imprisoning our employees, by imprisoning our users, by shooting people and with tanks. So ultimately, I think the trump card is on the government side. Now, that's obviously an extreme case. But the fact of the matter is that our employees are often at risk for imprisonment over some of the things that we do. And we're willing to risk that within reason because the principles that I'm articulating are so heartfelt. The legitimization question is really a question of how does capitalism work? We are fortunate that we sort of run the company under these set of principles, and the company itself has the economics to do this reach, so we can fund these things, and we get a chance of playing at it. But I can tell you on the other side, we're also the recipient of an enormous number of subpoenas, regulatory requests. We have huge government relations activities, and my frank job and most important job as executive chairman, now that I'm not CEO, is in fact working with governments to make sure that they don't do anything stupid. Right? Because what will happen is a leader will see a problem and they'll make up a solution which is either the wrong solution, not technically possible, or does not achieve their ends. So we spend lots of time talking to political leaders precisely to make sure that they're hand in hand. And with democracies, ultimately, if you're on the side of the citizens, you tend to win if you're Google. It's the non-democracies that are the problem because they're not responsive to what consumers want. They're responsive to what the leaders want.
Yes, sir. Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Kevin Prager. I'm a mid-career MPA student here. Good. Normally I'm a tech evangelist at NATO. Excellent. But I'm going to ask what I think is a somewhat challenging question. You were talking before about, I think it was cotton industry jobs that had gone the way of the dodo. And I wanted to ask is, just as a symbolic question, is investigative journalism the next cotton industry job? And if it is, or if things like that are the next cotton industry job, don't the internet giants have a responsibility to help plan for the disruption that they help cause?
We, and David and I have actually talked about this in other forums, I'm very concerned about the loss of investigative journalism in our country, especially at the state and local level. I think it's fair to say that no matter what happens, there'll be lots of people studying what Washington is doing, maybe the big cities, maybe Boston, et cetera. But there's a lot of parts of the country where the role of investigative journalism is now largely over because the economics don't work anymore. Mm-hmm. And the term of art is that we're trying to take analog dollars and replace them by digital pennies. And the monetization of those systems, especially in the local and regional level, is not producing the same amount of net cash flow to support it. So your question anticipates by saying that what is our responsibility? So we answer that by saying a number of things. The first is that we send clicks, which is sort of our commerce thing, to whatever sites we can. So we help send the online users that you're losing from print to those online sites. We have announced, and I've personally announced, both paywall products as well as subscription products as well as advertising products to try to make up this difference. I don't think the problem is fully solved. In France, we announced, in fact, I announced with the president, a fund to help the analog world move with digital alternatives, and we're actually funding those. So those are examples of the things that we're doing. I want to be honest and say that this is not a solved problem, and it's a very serious one, I think, for democracy in general. In the book, we actually talk about how will this play out. And one of the things we suggest is because of this remarkable obsession of celebrity in our country, that you'll see new forms of news gathering which are led essentially by celebrities. The joke is, sort of the Jay-Z newspaper. But the fact of the matter is that people care a lot about celebrities, and they get their information online from a lot of different sources. And so you could imagine that a celebrity-driven model might ultimately emerge as another way of getting more money into the system.
Thank you. Arjan, do you have a closing thought? No. I wanted to, let me ask you one last question. I'd like to return to something the Dean asked you before we walked in. And could you offer some preliminary thoughts about how the Kennedy School should prepare these emerging young leaders for the digital age?
I believe that the most effective people will be people who combine the questions that were asked today with an analytical view of the world. And I'm not saying science, and I'm not saying math, I'm saying analytical. I would argue that you should establish as your basic rule that everything that you do, write, or say, you've checked and has some likelihood of being true. At Google, this became our value very early, and so part of the reason we're always online is whenever anyone says anything, right, we check. And so it produces a much better conversation, right, because we have the same facts. And what I worry about our society in general is that there's no particular benefit to being factual. And in fact, television seems to operate better without facts, right? I was on a television debate where there's an complicated argument involving finances and economic growth, and one of the people who was a friend of mine made a statement that was in fact false. And I thought what to do, and I thought I won't embarrass her on the television, so I'll wait till we're done. And I corrected her privately, and she got furious at me. So then I went to the other side, another gentleman who had made a factually false statement, and he yelled at me too. And I thought, how bizarre, this is not Google. This is a serious story, because what I realized was that their goal was to be on television to make their point, even if they were wrong. When I make mistakes all the time, correct me, and I won't make the mistake again, and I'll apologize. So I would encourage, the one thing I would do at Harvard Kennedy School is I would take the position that it's okay to be wrong, it's a value to be corrected, and everybody should be using Google or your other favorite search engine to check the assertions, right? You can't have a proper conversation now about things without having some basis of fact. Otherwise, you're making stuff up. I feel this, well, I feel lots of things. Okay, I don't like the weather, I like the weather. I mean, what credible leadership position is that? And I am personally tired of the way our society works, finding myself now with that point of view being manipulated over and over again with half-baked ideas. So, and it's particularly true in the political sphere. So to the degree that you all are future political leaders, at least privately get the facts right before you decide to articulate only one side of the story.
Well, as the Dean said earlier, we would welcome you coming back in the fall to explore these questions further.
Thank you. You've been very, very kind, David.
Well, you can see you have a very receptive audience. I'm going to thank the students. These were, I thought, one of the very strong day of questioning. It was really.
This is, by the way, why on your book tour you should come to Harvard. Questions are a lot better here, guys. Trust me. Trust me. Watch the
You're going to be welcome back.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Welcome to a quite fascinating afternoon, I absolutely guarantee it. We're all looking forward to hearing from Eric Schmidt, who is the executive chairman of Google Inc. Probably some of you have never heard of it, but it's a small West Coast company. I think it's a startup somewhere. Eric has been the executive chairman of Google Inc. since 2011, but he's had a remarkable history of enormous activities in various sorts. Long ago, he was part of Bell Labs and Zlog Inc. and the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. He's paid his dues. He's changed the world. And it is truly astonishing, the kinds of things and the kinds of activities. Not very many people have been a part of a company that became a verb. And it is, we observed it in the past week, the kinds of, where does everybody go for information and the like. He's a member of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, the Prime Minister's Advisory Council in UK. He's been inducted in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's got a PhD in computer science from UC Berkeley, a BS in electrical engineering from Princeton University. And most important, he's got a spectacular daughter, Sophie, who's a member of our first-year MVP class. So I'm not going to say much more than that, except to note that this is a book that he'll be talking about, or certainly referencing or whatever, The New Digital Age. It just came out in the last couple of days. Now, of course, most of you probably already read it, but if you haven't, I urge you to do so, whether it's in physical copy or one of the other various forms. It is a very big book, and I mean big in the most important sense of the word. It's going to be big in that sense that it's provocative and it will get a lot of attention, but it's big because it will really make you think and think very differently about a lot of things. Eric Schmidt is joined today by two people who also need relatively little introduction. One is David Gergen, someone who you've also probably never seen, but occasionally makes appearances on television, and he's also our co-director of the Center for Public Leadership. Next to him on the other side is Arkan Feng, who's a professor of democracy and citizenship, and his research is very heavily focused on the impacts of civic participation in public deliberation, but he's quite engaged in a set of...
So the question is, what was the dictator, his name was Ben Ali, doing at the time? And the answer was he had censored everything, but he forgot to censor the internet. He was 80 years old. Okay? So one advice to him would be, you schmuck, you failed to censor the right thing. When we went to Myanmar and Burma, which of course just opened up a year and a half ago, and there are debates as to why it opened up. Was it brilliant democracy feelings from the generals, or was it conniving and careful self-interest in the face of great opposition? We can debate that. But we learned, for example, that the government had written in the law that you couldn't use email. So they wrote the law in 2004. This, of course, is a junta military government, and they banned Yahoo Mail and Hotmail. Everyone uses Gmail. So we'll take it, It's okay. Hopefully they'll let Hotmail and Yahoo Mail back into the country.
Okay. So why did you go with Sophie to North Korea? I mean, after all, you haven't played basketball.
No, in fact, I am permanently linked with Dennis Rodman.
Yeah.
In a way that would not have been a prediction.
Yes.
Months earlier. The conversation came around was, let's go visit the countries that are worst off. So we did a sort of tour of countries that are not countries you would normally go to, but which had very poor connectivity. And by far, North Korea is by far the most worst off. What we found was a country that was bizarrely, I don't know how to describe it. It's a cult in a very bizarre sense. And on the one hand, the impression when you're there is that life goes on, the kids are running around and smiling, people are playing in the playgrounds and that sort of stuff. Of course, there's no air pollution because there's no manufacturing, so the air is clear, unlike China where we had come from. But the thing that is most disturbing is the sense that there's no doubt, that there's no critical thinking, that people from birth are taught that this is the way and this is the only way. And they have because they have no independent source of information, they have no way of understanding that maybe this is not the only choice of organization of humans. And so we also found out that they have 1 million phones already in place with all the necessary infrastructure to turn on the internet They just haven't turned it on. Technically, this is turning on the GPRS signal. Just takes a little button. So we tried various attempts to get them to turn it on. After we left, they actually opened up 3G roaming, and then 2 weeks ago they turned it back off again. So I don't know what that tells you.
And there are a number of North Korean citizens you thought were sort of clustering up near the border?
We were in Pyongyang. Much of what we know about North Korea comes from dissidents and people who have left through the Chinese northern border, because that's sort of the only rational way to get out. You get killed in all the other paths, so you don't make it. And so by definition, they have a particular description of how the country works. So the sources of accurate information of how the government works are essentially nil. And I find it remarkable that in this day and age, we know so little about the decision making and so forth. So I've since met with various North Korean scholars who have, for example, explained to me that there's an uncle and a mother and there's this complicated structure that the respected leader, as the new 29 or 30-year-old is known, that he has to kowtow to, and all sorts of discussions about the politics of the army. What in fact has happened is this fellow replaced all of the army generals that were beholden to his father upon his father's death by a new set of people. So the first rule of a dictator is get rid of the old guys and replace them by people who are completely loyal to you. And in the army, since all men of a certain age in North Korea seem to be in the army, is probably a pretty good first step if you're the dictator.
Archon's going to jump in just a minute with a series of questions, but let me deal a bit with the domestic side. Your first chapter, the opening, talking about the life of individuals. That actually was sort of the most promising, the brightest portrait that you painted, how life would change. And you use this just an example: someone getting up in the morning, and how many things would be different from how we're living now. Could you give us a sense of that? And then I had a follow-up question.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the future over the next 5 or 10 years for the developed world. And my experience is that people are still sort of figuring out how to use their phones. And so they're sort of surprised when you understand the rate at which this is improving. So over the next 5 or 10 years, these phones will become your personal assistants in ways that you could not possibly imagine. This is all opt-in and with your permission and those sorts of things. But basically, because these are highly personal, they'll make suggestions to you. So simple ones like, leave now because there's a lot of traffic that'll happen in the next 30 minutes because we can model it and predict it.
They will have figured out what the traffic is between where you and where you're going.
Because it can calculate and anticipate that using artificial intelligence techniques. That's pretty good. What about, here I'm in Boston, I don't know that many people. There are people in this room who share the same political views as you do. You'd like to meet them. Would they like to meet you? That's something that is easy to do. You can go through all of these. Another example is in your email, and again, this is opt-in.
Issues that have to do with, first of all, digital HKS, our own initiatives of trying to get, understand and make a difference. A transparency project, how do you use technology and other strategies to get much more transparency in government and so forth. Before I turn this over to our group here, I'd just like to thank the Center for Public Leadership, the Ask Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and the Joan Shorenstein Center for the Press, Politics, and Public Policy for organizing and co-sponsoring this event. I'd like to again welcome Eric and all of you. A big hand for our guests. Thank you.
Thank you,
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon. This is an event we had not expected to happen just a few days ago, but here we are, and we're terribly delighted that Eric Schmidt has joined us. I might open with a quote from something that he published about 2.5 years ago in Foreign Affairs. That's a publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. And it was, the title of the piece was The Digital Disruption, and it was by Eric and by his co-author in the book, Jared Cohen. This was on November 2010. Opening paragraph, it predicted that, quote, governments will be caught off guard when large numbers of their citizens, armed with virtually nothing but cell phones, take part in many rebellions that challenge their authority. A month later, the Arab Spring began. With that as a background for the book that he's just written, I joined the dean and urging you to read it. It's a terrific read. I'd like to ask you what inspired you to write it, and what surprises did you find along the way yourself?
Well, first, I want to thank the dean and you guys for doing this, and acknowledge, of course, my daughter traveled with us and helped write the book, and she's well credited in the book as well. So she is actually the author of much of this, many of these particular points. The Jared and I started this 2 years ago because there seemed to be a gap between what the foreign policy establishment and government was talking about and what the technology world was doing. And whether that gap was a lack of understanding or frankly an age bias or one of these classic sort of generational gap issues, it wasn't clear. But in the subsequent 2 years, what we saw over and over again was that the old guys didn't get it. Classic example is Tunisia. The three of us went to Tunisia. We heard the story of Abu Aziz, who's the fellow who set himself on fire, which started the revolution. So your email, you've managed to do a reservation for an airplane, and it knows that you're always late. So it says, get in the car now, Eric. You're in big trouble because you allowed it to do that. Google Glass is just this week becoming available to a limited set of developers. So I have one. And I've been playing with it, and it's the weirdest thing, right? You can have this little vision, and you can see things, and you can let your friends see what you're looking at. But that's not what was so impressive to me. What was impressive to me is that you talk to it. So you say Google Glass, and it says hello, and it says that in your ear. And then you tell it it's query, it tells you the answer. And that's how good the voice recognition has gotten. So now imagine you have voice recognition plus 100 by 100 machine language translation, right? And all of a sudden we have a universal communicator, and we have the sort of Star Trek holodeck kind of a model. So all of that's going to happen in the next few years here. What happens after that? Well, this is more speculative, but there are many things. The most obvious ones are in medicine. Everyone's phone, which is attached to them. I mean, if I stole your phone right now, you'd have a conniption, right? You would, right? More important than stealing your wallet probably, or your purse even, which I wouldn't do, because it would be recorded. Right? It's a separate discussion. But the fact of the matter is that these devices are so personal that they'll be connected to our bodies in various ways. There are startups that are doing transdermal patches, which you put on, which Wi-Fi out what's going on in your blood, your body. There are pills, we talk about this in the book, that have been approved by the FDA that will Wi-Fi out what's going on inside your body. Right? So that talks to the phone calls the doctor looks at it and then calls you back and says, get to the hospital now, you're about to die. This kind of preventive and aggressive medicine will help save lives. There are example after example. So here's another one. We walk into a room, there's going to be a whiteboard, and the whiteboard will be, in fact, a translucent LCD. And the LCD will notice that you and I are friends, or we know each other, and it'll say, you met him a year ago. This is what he disagrees with you on. This is what he said about you. And it'll do the same thing for you, or maybe not. So the point is that this sort of computer aiding of life makes us infinitely more productive and more creative, which is ultimately, I think, one of the solutions to economic growth and all the other things.
Well, I wondered about that, and let me finish up with that question, because it does occur that you get up and you have all these splendid things. You get ready to get in the car that is automatic and will drive you to wherever, but that you have no job to drive to. I mean, even if you're a college graduate, there may be a shortage of jobs because robots may do a lot of the work that college graduates have been doing.
So